Behind me is the sacred grove. Somewhere within this space is where Joseph Smith went, seeking God, seeking Jesus Christ, looking for answers to several questions. How do I receive a remission of my sins? Which church is true? What's the purpose of my life, and what does God intend for me? And within this sacred space is where a pillar of light appears and descends upon Joseph Smith. The story of Joseph Smith's first vision has become one of the most important stories to Latter-day Saints. In fact, it's usually one of the first stories the missionaries tell prospective converts to the church. But what we want to explore today is how the story itself was shaped. Throughout his life, Joseph Smith told the story dozens of times, and there are 4 primary accounts that come from Joseph Smith. Understanding the context that each one of these accounts was written in is important to understand why the story was told the way that it was, who he was talking to, and why some of the details differ from account to account. So what we're going to try to do is go to each one of these locations where the first vision was shared and explore the circumstances that Joseph was in when he told the story of the first vision in each of these separate accounts. My name is Casey Griffiths, and I love learning about church history. Join me as we travel the world and explore the history of the Latter-day Saints. This is Restoration Revealed. Joseph Smith would eventually move from New York to Ohio due to persecution. It was here, about 30 miles south of Kirtland, at the John Johnson farm, where Joseph most likely wrote the first recorded account of the first vision, the 1832 account. Now, this is a particularly challenging time in Joseph's life. As the year begins in 1832, he loses a pair of twins. The same day that the twins are born and die, a woman in Orange, Ohio, who's joined the church, gives birth to twins, and she dies, but her twins survive. The father of these twins asked Joseph and Emma if they'll adopt them, and they move here to the John Johnson farm to take care of them. A few weeks later, in a mob attack, Joseph is not only badly beaten and tarred and feathered, but the little boy twin, little Joseph Murdoch Smith, who had measles, has his condition exacerbated and he dies a few days later. Problem after problem follows. Sidney Rigdon, after the mob dragged him from his house, suffered severe head trauma during the attack. On a trip back from Missouri, Newell K. Whitney badly breaks his leg. It's possible that while they were resting at an inn, that Joseph may have started writing his earliest account of the first vision. Eventually, he finished it up at the John Johnson farm with a scribe assisting. All this stuff is happening in Joseph's life, and it seems like the main audience who he's writing to is himself, to try and sort out the story of his life. The account is very, very personal. Joseph Smith writes about his history as a young man, and he emphasizes not which church he was searching for, but his own personal quest for salvation. He talks about walking through the woods and seeing the creations of God and wondering how he fits into things. Then he talks about how he prayed and had an appearance given to him. In the appearance, he talks about seeing the Lord and that the Lord called him by name and forgave him of his sins. And that's what makes this story a little bit controversial. Joseph Smith in the text appears to only describe one being. He doesn't describe the Father and the Son. He's probably just referring to Jesus Christ. Now, some people have used this to say that the church developed the idea that the Father and Son were separate a little bit later on. But in this same room, a few months before Joseph Smith wrote down the first vision, he received section 76, which describes the Father and Son as separate beings. He even says, "I saw the Son standing on the right hand of God." And even though this account doesn't directly mention God the Father, it does leave room for the Father still being present. But Joseph chose to focus on Jesus Christ. So this account is never published in Joseph Smith's lifetime, and we don't even discover it until the 1940s. But the personal nature of the account has made it resonate with a lot of people because it's less about finding the right church and more about finding God. And then when you find God, coming to know that God knows you is familiar with your problems and wants to help you with them, wants to allow you to receive forgiveness of your sin. In this account of the first vision, the very first thing restored is not the knowledge that the church has to come back. It's the knowledge that the atonement of Jesus Christ can still help people overcome and receive forgiveness of their sins. Now, the next account of the first vision has an even stranger context, so we're going to go a little north of here to Kirtland, Ohio, and talk about Joshua, the Jewish minister. Kirtland, Ohio was the headquarters of the church during this time. Joseph and Emma had a little home just a block away from the Kirtland Temple. It was here where the 1835 account was recorded. We're here in Kirtland, Ohio, near the restored home of Joseph and Emma Smith. And one of the things that makes this place so unique is that in here is where Joseph Smith would entertain guests that came and visited him during his time that he lived here in Kirtland, Ohio. In fact, one of the more interesting guests that shows up is a man who comes to the house and introduces himself as Joshua, the Jewish minister. He stays here for several days, and over the course of his conversations with Joseph Smith, they come to realize that his name is not Joshua, nor is he Jewish, nor is he a minister. In fact, his alias was Matthias. And over the course of several days, Joseph Smith comes to know the man's real identity. His name is not even Matthias. His actual name was Robert Matthews. He was kind of known throughout the Northeast United States as this notorious figure who'd been accused of manslaughter, murder. And Joseph Smith and Robert Matthews engaged in all these theological conversations that are captured in Joseph Smith's journal. Now, Matthias had some pretty grandiose claims. For instance, he claimed that he was the Holy Spirit and that he possessed the Spirit of Christ himself. And Joseph Smith basically answers him and says, I know that you're not, and here's the reason why. In this spot, speaking to Robert Matthews, Joseph gives the second recorded account of the first vision. It's recorded in his journal, and in this, he describes several details that weren't in the earlier 1832 account. He mentions that when he went to the grove, there was a force that tried to stop him, that bound his tongue and attempted to prevent him from communing with God. Then he mentions the appearance of the Father and Son. He says a pillar of flame came down, which may have been an adjustment he made because he's talking to a person he believes is Jewish. There's a pillar of fire featured in the Old Testament. Other accounts say that it alternated between flame and light. One of them even says he thought that the trees were going to burst into flames around him. In the midst of that pillar, a being appears and then introduces a second being. The Father and the Son both appear. And Joseph Smith says the first thing that they told him was that his sins were forgiven. Joseph Smith even mentions there were many angels that he saw within that vision. So he tells this to Robert Matthews. And then after a couple of days, they still don't kick the guy out of the house after he confesses that he's Matthias. Joseph Smith in his journal records after breakfast, so they bring him in, they feed him breakfast. He says, I told him that my God told me that his God was the devil and I could not have him any longer. And so I cast out the devil and I believe a murderer also. So second account of the first vision recorded here in Joseph Smith's home in 1835. Now we're going to go to another place and explore the next account of the first vision, which was written down in 1838 in the far west Missouri. After repeated persecution in Kirtland, Joseph and Emma moved to far west Missouri, the new headquarters of the church. But the persecution was building up here as well. In the midst of all this is where we find the 1838 account. There's not much here today, but in the midst of these rolling fields in northwest Missouri, there was once a city of 5,000 people and the headquarters of the church. In fact, the spot I'm standing right now is the spot where a temple was going to be built. This temple never got any further than laying the cornerstones, but for a short time, far west was the headquarters of the church. In fact, the Doctrine and Covenants from section 113 to section 120 is received here. There's even this nice monument behind me that memorializes some of these revelations that were given. For our purposes, the reason why we've come here today is because this is the place where Joseph Smith records the 1838 account of the first vision. This is the canon account of the first vision. It's Joseph Smith's official history, part of which is excerpted, placed into the scriptures, canonized, and today is found in the Pearl of Great Price. Understanding the context of what was going on in Joseph Smith's life helps us understand why in this account of the first vision, he emphasized certain things that he didn't in other accounts of the first vision. He comes here after being evicted from his home in Kirtland, Ohio. He was afraid for his life and was forced to flee here. And when he gets here in Far West, he finds that the local settlers are just as hostile here as well and want to forcibly evict the saints from Far West. So Joseph Smith at this point has told the story on several occasions, but now he's going to write his official history. So he sits down and he gets precise dates, exact locations. He gives a lot of background and context and detail. He mentions that he visited a various number of churches before he decided to approach God directly. He mentions that when God and Jesus Christ appeared to him, they told him that none of the churches were true and that there had to be a restoration that happened. He also goes out of his way to mention that when he first told a preacher about the first vision, he received nothing but scorn and persecution. The environment surrounding Joseph, where he's in the midst of all this hostility, shapes this account of the first vision and causes him to reflect on the parts of the message of the first vision that have to do with the place of the church among other churches and why there is so much persecution and opposition to the message. So here in Far West is where the account of the first vision that most missionaries teach from and most church members study directly was written down for the first time.
Sadly, the persecution escalated into extreme violence. Saints were murdered and abused. They fled out of Missouri and into Illinois. And here, they turned a swamp into a prospering city. It was here that we find the 1842 account.
So we're here in Nauvoo. And in 1842, Joseph Smith published another account of the first vision. This one is popularly known as the Wentworth letter. It was written to a man named John Wentworth, who was the editor of the Chicago Democrat, who was writing a history of New Hampshire. So Joseph Smith wrote a letter to John Wentworth explaining his basic history and the basic beliefs of the church. We actually don't have the original letter, and John Wentworth apparently never used it when he published his history, but the letter itself was published in the Times and Seasons, which was a newspaper published by the church in Nauvoo. The Wentworth letter gives a few details of the first vision that we don't find in other places. Like Joseph Smith said, he was carried away in the Spirit. He also talks about how the Father and Son exactly resembled each other in features and likeness. And the Wentworth letter doesn't become the official account of the first vision, but just to demonstrate the importance of the Wentworth letter, part of it was canonized and placed in the Pearl of Great Price. Specifically, at the end of the Wentworth letter, Joseph Smith included 13 articles of faith that explained the basic beliefs of the Latter-day Saints. Those 13 articles of faith are placed into the Pearl of Great Price and canonized by the church in 1880.
It was also in Nauvoo where Joseph shared the first vision with several people. These records we have as second or third-hand accounts. Some of these give us extra details, such as Joseph going to a place where he'd left his axe. Another account says that the vision left him unconscious. Others confirmed the fire or the angels that he saw. But now let's travel back to Utah and meet an expert on these accounts, Steve Harper, and get additional insight into why these accounts vary so much.
Hello, Steve.
Casey,
How are you?
great. How are you?
Good. We've been visiting spots where the first vision was written down and talking about the different accounts, but you've done a lot of research on the first vision. What would you say to someone who is a little shaken by the fact that there's different accounts of the first vision and that they don't always exactly agree in their details?
I'd ask them why. In other words, a person who has that point of view is making some assumptions about knowledge. We could use some examples. We could say, what do you think about the accounts of Jesus' ministry and resurrection? We have a variety of accounts of that, and they don't match, right? John has a completely different view of the Passover, the last week of Jesus' life, than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, we could say either, well, that means I don't believe any of it. It's got to be bogus. Or we could say, maybe there are reasons for that I haven't thought about yet. We would want to encourage this person to not assume, right? Seek knowledge and don't stop at assumptions. Don't assume that what you think you know is knowledge. Ask it questions. Ask questions about memory. This is what you and I do every day. I'm a total believer in Joseph Smith's first vision accounts. I know them well. You know them well. It's simply not the case that people who know them well lose faith in the vision. No less than Stephen Prothero, who was a highly regarded professor of American religion, not a Latter-day Saint. He wrote about the first vision. He says he'd be more skeptical if Joseph produced these carbon copy accounts throughout his life, as if he were conspiring, than if Joseph just produces, spontaneous ones like the 1835 account, or these really labored written processes like 1832 and 38, where Joseph starts off by telling us, I don't write. Right? The first thing he disclaims in both of those is, don't hold me to a higher standard than you can. He feels obviously incapable of recording and writing something that defies all description. So we can decide to interpret Joseph as authentic and trustworthy, or we can decide from the outset that we're hostile to him and we don't believe anything he says. Well, that tells more about us than it does about the documents. Your present situation shapes the way you remember. I think that in the 1832 autobiography, we hear what the vision was like to Joseph at the time. But the vision comes to mean more over time, right? And by 1832, Joseph can see backwards and see meaning, including being called as a prophet, that he didn't have at his disposal when the vision occurred. Whereas in 1835, he just goes, right? Yeah. He's just having a conversation. It's oral. And when we read the accounts, this one is fast-paced. He runs through it, and he doesn't seem to be burdened by, now, how do I write a sentence again? What's a misplaced modifier? Where do I have to put punctuation? Those things that trouble Joseph are not present in the 1835 account. So it feels freer. And when Joseph writes the manuscript history that we know so well, he's just come off the very worst year of his life, as you know. Mm-hmm. Driven from Ohio in time to get to Missouri, in time to be worse treated in Missouri, murders of many, many saints, rapes of many, many saints. And then Joseph sits and thinks about that for several months in Liberty. When he's out, one of the first projects he works on is this manuscript history, and he's really, really, really frustrated. So it's peppered with the words persecution, and then adjectives, bitterest persecution, hot persecution. He's got a persecution complex. And then when you look at the Wentworth letter, you'll notice that it's gone away. Here he's trying to enlist powerful allies who could help him. Joseph is being invited to tell his own story. And so it's very different in tone, whereas in the manuscript history version, we have the Savior saying, all of their creeds are an abomination. Their professors are all corrupt. In the Wentworth letter version, we have the Lord saying, or Joseph paraphrasing the Lord saying, they were all believing in incorrect doctrines, right? Same message in a way, but certainly softened. Sometimes people, when they read the accounts, they try to force either or, right? They try to say, well, the 1832 is about his personal situation. 1838 is about a church. And I don't think Joseph Smith saw them that way. It's true that you can find different emphasis in the other, but if he were here and we were to say to him, as some of the critics do, you only meant in 1832 your personal sinful state. You weren't looking for the right church, right? You'd say, no. I was questing for the church where I could find remission of my sins. And if we could have Joseph's own explanation, he'd try to help us understand, you're making more of this than there really is. I'm telling you what I really feel and really think.
Steve's insights have proved invaluable. It's human nature to adjust our personal stories based on our audience, our memory, our maturity, our context. It doesn't mean the stories are false. In fact, Joseph's accounts have a powerful consistency, and each one can provide powerful insights into our spiritual journeys. To end our journey, we're back in Palmyra, New York, where a temple here has a unique feature that most other temples don't have.
On April 6th, 170 years after the church was organized, a temple was dedicated right across the street from the sacred grove. The temple is beautiful. It has 27 different stained glass windows and then 2 clear windows, the only clear windows on the temple that allow a person walking into the temple to look across the way and see the sacred grove. Even the groundskeepers have trimmed down the forest right here, so it's possible for a person to stand in the temple and then look over here and see the sacred grove. And the temple, like the accounts that we've explored today, stands as a witness to the truth of Joseph Smith's experience with deity in that grove across the way. The temple, the accounts, and all these things demonstrate to us that the story that Joseph Smith told when he emerged from the grove is just as important today as it was nearly 200 years ago when he first saw the Father and the Son.
The temple points at not just a location, but to hope. That God and his Son know us and have a plan for us. And just like Joseph Smith did over 200 years ago, we can ask God for answers. And while we won't be called with a heavenly vision to restore the gospel, we can find the sweet peace Joseph found in his first account. That God lives, that he loves us, that he'll forgive us, and that he can guide us throughout our life. Thanks for watching this episode of Restoration Revealed. If you'd like to help us create more, please use the donate link in the description below.